so we got some great shots down there near Tamasopo on the trampoline. Now let's go in and work with the raw processing and see what we can do with them, see what kind of results we can get, and finish up some images. Step into my office.
Remember, we had 2 days here that I kind of spanned this across. So I marked the green ones from the first day and the yellow ones here from the second day. I'm working in Lightroom today, but really whatever you're working in doesn't really matter because the principles of processing our raw files and seeing kind of the results we got from, taking the time to kind of analyze our compositions. And I didn't do a lot of different setups. Tried some different things out, but ultimately it's going to come down to a couple compositions as we talked about in last month's Jungle Run video. So let's go through here and I'm just going to look. Some of these I've tinkered with a little bit. I put a few ratings on some of these, but we're going to go through and just kind of flip through and look at the best ones. Now, there's a couple issues. These are like the first ones, right? I went out that first morning and I saw that it was really great. I grabbed a few phones on my iPhone and then I went and got the good camera and I was kind of in a hurry to capture the good light. So these are just kind of some of the first tinker around shots. I mean, you can see that I didn't really do much on this one in terms of quality. It's all blurry. One of the things I'll do quite a bit is as soon as I see something inspiring, I'll grab a camera and I'll just start doing some test images, right? And so I'll look around and do a couple different things. But ultimately my goal is to settle down on a tripod and just go through. Now I'm going to go through and we're going to talk about a couple of these, going to rate a couple of these, and you can kind of see, I'm showing you just the raw images, so you can kind of see a little bit where I screwed up and where I was just messing around and where I nailed it. Less is more to me when I'm doing compositions like this. So even over these 2 days, we're only going to probably see 50 or 60 images in here, including just my experimental and test shots. You can see that I was playing around here, right? You can notice that I had a little bit of vignette, and you'll see that right up here. And again, being on the tripod, watching for little details like that saves me a lot of time later. And so you'll see on a couple of these, my hand is right up there on the corner of the lens, holding back that flare, not a vignette, a flare, and helping control that. Of course, with a lens hood, you could do this too. But a lot of times, I'm trying to keep my bag compact, and as long as I'm paying attention, honestly, I can do a lot with my hand. But you'll see a couple of differences on these ones. This one I've actually done some processing too, and this is coming out really well. We're very, very bright in here, but if you look at our histogram, we're still okay. We're not into the clipping zone. A lot of what I try to do in the landscape, but really in every image, is not try and punch everything into the midtones. Try to really use that tonal range from zone 0 to zone 10, have almost blacks to almost white in an image. And you can see just the little edge of my finger up here, but I can just crop down a little bit and we'll have a flare-free image. In fact, cropping a little bit of this sky out here is not a bad thing. And I might crop a little on the bottom too. Let's go through first though and pick out a few favorites and see what we have first. Now you can see I've already marked this one a 5-star, so that's one of my favorites. We're going to come back to that one. I'm just going to flip through and see. Now, there's a couple good ones here, and when it comes down to multiple images that are good, what will do is I'll come in and I'll look side by side, right? And so if I have a couple compositions, you can see on a lot of these I have compositions that are very similar because, again, I was going for a setup, right? I'd find a good setup and I'd go for it. So at that point, I'm going to look at things like, well, how's my background? My background's a little out of focus here. And even though this is the main subject, on a landscape like this, I want that depth of field to go all the way back. So this one actually lacks a little bit. I'm going to downrate it a little, even though it's a neat image. Good detail here. The detail in these is beautiful, but my depth of field is a little off. And this is one of the things I'm always going to do when I am doing a setup, and why I love being on a tripod is because I can set up, I can know what composition I'm looking for, and then I'll come back and say, okay, well, what am I missing? Let's look through and see if I increased my depth of field at all. Let's see here. That one's a little better, but there's still some blur back there. And I was struggling a little bit with the focus distance on these because I wanted this close-up stuff to be in focus, but I didn't want to lose that back end. And some of these, I'm running f8. I should have been running a little higher aperture on this, and I probably did on some of the later ones, and we'll come back to that. a lot of what I'll do too is if everything isn't focused, the difference might just come down to randomness, right? This one has more sharpness here. The way the water flowed in one image was better than another, because especially when you're talking about long exposures, remember that every long exposure is going to be different. But honestly, I'm a bit disappointed with myself on this particular composition because I just don't have a lot of focus in the far, far back. Is it a nice image? Sure. You could even argue that it's okay that that's out of focus. Is it? I don't know. I mean, this foreground is my subject here, but I don't really want that diminished. Now, you can see that some of them are sharper than others, and we are looking at 40 megapixel files here. This one still has a fair amount of detail on this rear rock here, but not as much as I would like. And there's probably going to be better images than some of these ones. Bear in mind, part of the loss of detail is motion and mists too. So when you're looking at an image and you say, okay, what's wrong? You want to keep in mind everything you're dealing with. Sometimes when you're dealing with foggy mist, it's going to make it seem a little softer back there, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes motion and things blurring. In this case, I really just don't have as much depth of field as I would like. Let's keep looking through. Some of them you can see I was just experimenting. And normally I wouldn't show people all these, but you guys are PhotoKit. And here we go. This is one of my favorites here. And again, we talked about positioning, micro positioning. This is fog detail here. So this isn't really out of focus. We're just seeing a little bit of mistiness from the fog. And this is a beautiful looking image here. A little bit of motion. This is 4 seconds. So of course there's going to be some motion in the water and the tree branches and stuff like that. But overall, the feel of this, I'm really liking. Definitely kind of an ethereal, misty quality to this. And stuff like this sun, in fact, I remember tinkering with this, moving just a couple inches to the right can be the difference between a sun that's just blown out and too much and a sun that is just making a nice little star through the trees and through the branches. So it's those little details on things like that that are going to be very important. This one's really cool. Is that too much of a star flare compared to the other ones? Maybe. We might go with the previous one, but good detail on this image. And bear in mind, when we're zooming in here, we are really zooming in because when I zoom in, we're looking at 1-to-1s on these 40 megapixel files. You can see how I was tinkering around. It was just very slight micro positioning in this composition to get different results in the sun, waiting for the sun to move, the mist to move just a little bit. And so it's all the same composition, but slight variations of that composition to give us the result we wanted. This one's really nice. It has no sun at all. Let's see if there's a crop. Nope, that's the full frame. This one has no sun at all, and we are, bear with me, sharp as a tack on these critical elements, and really all the way back there's pretty strong sharpness here. What's cool about this one is while there's not a sun flare, you got this really nice shape here, kind of this U shape of the rocks, and so your eye, with the flow of the motion of this water in this 2.5 second exposure, is kind of moving and flowing forward. So I'm going to mark that one as a favorite. And there's a couple along these lines that are kind of similar here in different varied compositions. And ultimately, it's going to come down to, as we're talking about these refinements, when you have 2, 3, 4, 5 images of a composition, then it comes down to looking at them side by side. Some of these, we're just experimenting. Where I put my hand over the top is a marker because I'm doing multiple shots for potentially stitching together later. So these shots individually aren't going to look like much. And I don't know if this is my favorite anyhow, so I may not actually stitch these. But what I do, kind of my quick in the field tactic, if I want to do a stitch sequence, is I'll cover a hand over the lens for one, do my sequence, and cover a hand. And that's kind of an open and a closed representation of a stitch sequence. It's just kind of my little field hack. But some of these ones are pretty neat. The struggle in a scene like this is it can get very busy very fast. And that's why some of these ones aren't on the top of my list. They're nice images, but I'm tending to focus on the ones that had a more dominant focus. So ultimately, we're going to come down and I'm going to pick a couple from these 2 days. This is cool too. There's a lot of really neat images, but are they great images? That's what I'm looking for. This is a 4-star. I'm going to call it. and just keep going through. I did some different close-ups of the water. Some of these might be really good in black and white, but let's filter down, okay? So let's actually start doing some processing. We've kind of gone through and looked at these. I'm going to take the 4-star and higher. Let's just pick a couple. This one, let's see here. Now, here we go. This one here is nice. You can see these ones here where I was a little closer at 24 millimeters and tightening up. My depth of field was not as good as it should have been. I should have stopped down to f11. One of the reasons you might say, well, why don't you just stop down on all of them? One of the reasons I don't stop down on all of them is because we will lose quality if we stop down too much. You get kind of a diffraction. There's scientific terms for all this. Bottom line is the lens is kind of an optimum, and so I try to stay around f8, f11, maybe f13. This does vary by lens, and you can do studies and tinker with your lenses and find out where the sweet spot is. Bottom line is, if you take most lenses that are for 35 millimeter frame cameras and you start ramping those up into f16, f18, f20, you're actually going to start losing detail. And you may have noticed that if you've done that before, it almost looks like it's artifacty or a little bit blurry. And so you really got to try and play with that sweet spot a little bit and see what works. Okay, I've got some different effects, and we're going to tinker with these a little bit. Here is last month's presets, and we might use some of these and mix it in, but we also have some new ones that I'm working with for this month. They're just different variations and different dynamic ranges and stuff like that. And you don't have to be in the jungle to use these. I mean, these are going to be pretty versatile, wide-ranging. Wow, that one looks really good. Presets that are going to work on a lot of different scenes. And there's even a black and white one. Now, this frame is actually really cool. We have good focus, we have good sharpness, and overall, I'm really liking this. I'm debating where to stop that crop line, right? We could come over here and do it more like this and keep the focus here, or we could keep the wide intent that I had on this one and kind of leave this tree. I'm inclined to kind of stop it right here. So we have this big gnarled tree kind of coming out from the left, and it's a fine line, right? This goes back to some of the videos I did last month. You can see there's a little bit of softness because we're shooting wide on this lens in terms of the focal length. This is on the 17 to 40. It's a good lens, but sometimes at 17 millimeters, full wide open. This is common with most wide-angle lenses. You're going to see a little bit of detail loss right on the corners, but overall, I mean, it's just vivid and sharp. I'm really liking the result, and this would print phenomenally. We could easily go, 50, 60 inches on this, and I don't think we would have a problem. I'm gonna start looking at my crop first. So I'm gonna look at little things like the details down here. Is there leaves? Is there stuff that could be cropped out, or should it be cloned out? Of course, as we talked about in last month's video, even down to moving trash, I want there to be as much as possible in the frame that's been taken care of. But I'm going to work on the cropping just a little bit, thinking about where the frame stops. Remember, we talked about the frame stop, and I did another video on that on my YouTube channel recently. Head over to the YouTube channel if you're not subscribed. I think I want the little corner arch of this tree to be included. All right, so I'm going to leave that, and we're going to decide how far up to go. If I crop all the way up, I kind of have this void up here, and I don't like that. Some things you can't change in camera, but what I can do is think about my crops and kind of stopping right where these leaves stop, right? Same on this side. I can stop kind of in here, determine where I want to stop, how I want the light to fade out. These leaves over here are kind of a good fade out. They're a little bit darker. So now my eye's coming in, it's seeing this, it's seeing this, it's taking in all this detail throughout this image. And this is 0.4 second. So it's not crazy blurred, but it still has a nice motion blur to it. What I'm going to do now is, okay, we got some of these presets, but let's tinker with these. And I'm probably going to take the finished version, the best versions of these presets, and update for them for you in this month's photo kit presets. Let's work the highlights just a little bit on this. And there's a couple ways I can do that. One is to go like this, and I can drop these highlights way back and bring a little into the water. I'm going to undo that. Now let's look. Let's turn on the clipping indicators. You can see that I'm not really clipping. There's a little tiny bit of clipping here, and there's a little tiny bit of black clipping, which I'm okay with. I don't mind a little bit of black clipping, but I always try and avoid any white clipping. So what I'm going to do is target that white clipping. But if I just globally drop those highlights, I'm kind of losing some of that oomph in the rest of the image. And I think we're going to be better off to recover this with just a brush. And we could also use a gradient tool. But for now, I'm just going to use a brush on this, and we're going to feather it at a midpoint. And I'm just going to kind of brush in to this hot area in the water. And nothing's been done to it yet because I haven't set the settings. Now I can change things, right? Of course, that's horrible. Typically on something like this, I'm going to use a little bit of highlight recovery rather than exposure. And I really do want to keep the water pretty white. This goes back to using that whole tonal range. So you can see now that I've got rid of the clipping. And I'm going to do the same in this sky. And I'm going to bring this blue sky up here down just a little bit too. But I'm actually going to keep this right on the edge of the zone 10s in that water. And so you can see here, I don't want to drop it much. I'm going to drop it a little. And I'm going to brush in a little bit more on this really bright spots over here just to bring it down and around the edges. And then once we get into final burn and dodging, I'm going to take this a little bit further. And you're going to see a little more coming out of it with the burn and dodging. In fact, probably a lot more. So what we're doing now is whatever raw processor I'm using, I'm going to want to work and interact directly with this raw file to pull out the initial dynamic range and quality. When it comes to the finessing, I'm going to go into a pixel editor like Photoshop, where I can specifically manipulate and finish the details to get that look I want. But overall, we have great detail, and I'm going to go all out with this one probably once we take it into Photoshop and just determine how do we want to bring out the texture in the water and really make this come alive. But you know what? We got texture in the trees, little bit of motion from the slow shutter speed and the close-up leaves and branches, but it's kind of building this arch-like canopy, little bit of softness over here when we really zoom in, and probably this was actually from the breeze, because the depth of field is good, but we see there's some motion on this grass over here, and it's probably from it actually being blown around, which is not necessarily a bad thing when we're looking for a little motion. It's interesting, and this goes back to doing different frames of the same composition and then taking the time to utilize each of those to determine your look, because when you're talking about slow shutter speeds in particular, the leaves will blow a little bit differently, the breeze will come a little differently, the water will flow a little differently, and so it can actually make a lot of difference in your frame. Now, these ones are nice, but I just don't really like that softness there. And so, we could certainly apply, let's do the deep water preset here, and it's really cool, and it's got a lot of richness. And this is a neat image, but honestly, I feel like, even if I bring some more into these shadows, there's a little bit, this water's really cool, but there's not a great lead in, and I don't like the increased softness in the background. I could totally get away with this on Facebook, right? But when I'm thinking about an image, I'm always going to try and think about, okay, how is this going to print, right? Nobody would notice that this was not tack sharp if I was just posting it on my online portfolio. But at the end of the day, we not only ask ourselves the technical questions about the 6 keys to image quality, which is something you can read about over on the Seim Effects site, but also we want to ask ourselves, what's the overall feel of the image looking like? This one's wide, and you could argue that there's a lot of clutter, but wait till we're finished with it and see the finished result. Sometimes my gut might say, let's take the zoom in version, but because the wider version is sharper, and I think once we control the tones in the finishing on that, it'll really come out and be beautiful. Now you can see in these exposures, here's another good one. I'm going to mark our favorites in red, and those ones, we'll take a couple of those into Photoshop. But this is another one of my favorites, and there's just a couple in this lineup that are all favorites. We got this really neat mist here, but it's hard to beat these ones here where the sun is peeking through. So basically we have 3 or 4 in this compositional lineup, and you can see that I'm clipping a little bit, but remember, this is a raw file. If this was not a raw file, if this was a phone photo, this would be lost, right? But when I'm exposing, I'll push my highlights right up into the clipping if it means getting the rest of the shot the way I want, because I know that I can then pull that back and recover that and maintain those details, because on this one, this is an A7R2 file, and most of our modern cameras in the raw file is just a ton of of dynamic range. So the question becomes, which one do I like the best? Well, this one looks good. Let me turn off those clipping indicators for just a moment. This one looks really good, but it doesn't have that sun. So in a sense, it's clearer, right? It's more pristine and vibrant because you don't have that light coming into the lens and striking the front of the lens from the sun flares. But some people hate sun flares. I think when you use a sun flare right in a landscape, it's truly beautiful. Now, I think we need a little dehazing because you can see what's happening here is, well, it is clear and we have some mists and that's part of it. But part of it is also we're getting a bit of haziness from the sun hitting the lens, which is kind of inevitable in a context like this if we wanted to get that sun flare. But we can use a little bit of dehazing in the post to kind of bring some of that back. And don't underestimate, yes, we want things clear and sharp, but sometimes a little bit of an ethereal, hazy feel can be really powerful. This one I'm not liking quite as well because there's a little bit of sun, just enough to distract us, but not enough to be really compelling. Still a nice image. I mean, I like it, but let's look at some of our other options. This one I'm really liking just because of the way the sun flare is not over the top, but it's also has distinction, right? You got this nice, classy flare over here. So this might come down to kind of a personal preference of your style, right? We have a couple of different of the composition with no flare. This is almost a different composition here. I've gone wider here is what I've done. So if you see this one, it's just, I've kind of stepped back in the perspective and it's made a little bit of a different feel. And we actually have kind of some sun rays coming in from the left here. So this one's beautiful. I'm definitely down for that one. Let's look at one of these though that has the other framing. And let's just kind of compare those. Let's kind of look at what I did differently in the framing of those two, just to kind of show the thought process. So you can see that I think what I actually did is stepped back on this one. We have a little bit of light pollution that's beautiful in texture. Look at the texture in this water. It's just gorgeous, but this could be distracting because we have this kind of sunspot. When I was shooting this one, and this is one of the reasons I shot 2 mornings here, I was actually kind of waiting, like seeing if the sun would move, trying to make sure, because when you get to that moment where the sun is coming up and filtering through the trees, which particularly in forests and in jungles and stuff like that, it's kind of this magic moment, but you also start getting those hot specular highlights very quickly, and so you got to watch those. Let's look at the 2 different ones. So we have 2 here that have the sun popping through, and I'm just going to kind of take these and rearrange them a little bit. I'll put this one over here to where there's no sun with these ones. So let's take one. Let's pick a favorite of the sun coming through. And we can see that these are both close to a second. They're both f9, ISO 50, and 24 millimeters. All right. At this point, these are very similar. And so when I have 2 compositions like this, and if I'm setting up and taking the time for a composition, I'm always going to do it a couple of different times to try and get the best result, just in case the camera moved, just in case something went wrong. I'm going to zoom in and just check our sharpness. And we can see that both of these have good detail. Honestly, all the way back. This one on the left has more sun flare, which is actually costing us a little more loss of detail on that left side. But in terms of the overall detail in the water, it's really good. My concern here is because there's more mist, we have more sun hitting the mist here. At the same time, that mist looks really cool. The corners down here are sharp on both. This is something I was taking particular time for, is trying to find a balance of my focus, kind of focusing to the middle point with a little bit of hyperfocal going on in terms of just meaning getting that focused balance, right? If I put all the focus here, the background would be blurry at f9, and if I put all the focus here, the foreground would be blurry at f9. So finding that sweet spot, and dang, this image here I'm really liking. Let's just look and make sure we're going to be able to pull back the heavier clipping in that water, and let's just apply, in the mist rather, not the water. Let's apply one of these presets. I think with this raw file, we'll be okay on this. And we can also do a little bit of pixel painting detail in Photoshop if we need to. But yeah, I mean, we're actually not in the clipping anymore. So we've pulled that clear of the clipping, but it's still very hot. And I might actually do some manual brush work once we go to our Photoshop details. It's also a little dark overall. So let's just kind of experiment. Let's use this preset. Let's use the River 1. And that's looking really, really good. It's brightening up the whole image now. And so look at these swirls in the water, the detail in the greens down here. The only negatives I'm really seeing here is this is a little bright. And so let's take a brush and actually do that. It looks like I was brushing on it a little bit already. Let's see here what I did. Yeah, I brushed this in a little bit just to restore some of it. So we'll work with that. We'll see what I did. I basically just brushed in the mist there. I'm going to pull back the highlights on those a little bit more. And let me use the O key to cycle through the masks so I can see this brush is actually covering quite a bit of this image here. So I'm going to do a new brush just for the mist right back here. And just for the sun spot right here. The main thing is I don't want those clipping. It's okay to have white. White is not the enemy in an image, but at the same time, you definitely want to have that balance. And so I'm going to pull back the contrast, maybe the clarity. I could go up or down, but a lot of times I find if I want the ethereal look, if I just back off on the clarity a little bit in an area, it'll actually help. I could do dehaze localized on these, and I'll use just a little, but not much. Again, I can come back to these, and when we get into the finish process. With an image this good, I'm always going to take it into Photoshop. I'm never going to say it's enough because it's in Lightroom, and you're going to see that once we go into our Photoshop session on our favorites from this, because it's really going to bring out what was a good image, and we're going to make it a great image. So I'm going to be careful cropping too much before I go into Photoshop, because of course then I'm committed, right? So I'm going to leave this pretty much full frame, although ultimately I probably will crop down to about here. And see, you notice how that kind of takes away some of that distracting sky, and our eye really leads in kind of at the sun, bounces to the left, goes to the mist, and we have this arching rock pattern around here that kind of keeps our eye from leaving. We're shadowed over here on the right, and that prevents our eye from bouncing out of the scene. And these are all these kind of concepts that we've been doing in this whole series down by the trampoline as we talk about the frame stops and micro positioning and all this kind of stuff. And I'm hoping this is just going to kind of bring all this together for you guys. So I'm going to give that one a red label because that is definitely one of the favorites for me here. And let's just look at a couple others. Look, there was lots of good images here, but a lot of it was a question of which ones do I want to put the energy into. There's the other sun one, the one with no sun flare to speak of. And we can see that one just doesn't have quite the luminance, kind of that backlit magical feel that I was looking for. I do like this one because of the way the rocks down here wrap around and they really lead my eye through the scene. I'm going to straighten this out just a little bit. That was too much. It's lagging on me probably because I'm screen recording. Okay, let me undo that. And I'm just gonna straighten this out a little tiny bit so it feels right. Sometimes a good crop is less of an exact line and more of, does it feel right? And, another thing we could do with this one, this is beautiful, but if I wanted a different approach, even though mostly my visualization in these was with color, I was also kind of thinking, wow, we could do some cool black and whites, and there's just so much texture in here that we can work with on that. But let's actually go back to the river. And this is a really great ultra high dynamic range scene. We definitely need to darken down this side a little bit. Overall, we got great detail throughout. Just a little bit of softness in this side on the very edge of the frame when we zoom in 1-to-1. Great detail down here. Look at this grass, the texture of the water kind of flowing down on these 3 different little rivulets here. What I'm going to do here before we even go into Photoshop is you can see I've added a little bit of a gradient right here. And gradients in Lightroom work great. Again, trying to take advantage of the raw file, because once we go into Photoshop, we're not working directly with that raw file anymore. I'll be exporting to a 16-bit lossless TIFF. Now you can see that I've darkened this a little bit when I was playing around before I started the video. I'm going to actually darken it a little bit more. Obviously, we like that kind of golden glow on that water there, but if it's too much, it's going to become distracting. So I'm going to back it off and diminish it just a little bit, all right? But then I'm going to come through with another gradient from this side. And to balance them out, I think what we'll do is we'll warm up a gradient on this side a little bit. Okay, not a lot. I'm just going to add a little bit of warmth into there. And we'll play with our kind of backlight that water by using the whites and the highlights and the contrast just a little bit. So rather than darken the highlights on that one, I'm going to leave them bright. And we're going to put just a little bit of warmth. And what I'm kind of going for here, and we'll complete this when we go into Photoshop, but what I'm kind of going here is this is a little bright, but the texture is beautiful. And so what we want to do is bring out the texture to the right here, so there's a kind of a synergy between them. They don't look too different between the two parts. And I'm going to take this gradient here and just darken down the top area just a little bit so that it doesn't become a distraction. I like my edges, and this is partly personal preference, but there's also technique here. You don't want the viewer's eye to bounce out of the frame. And so a lot of times if I have like an overhead tree canopy or something like that, I'm going to darken that down, and I might even crop off the bottom a little bit. And you can see down here, the question is, where do I want to stop on these little bits of foliage, right? Because I want a nice kind of stair step. See how this kind of leads in here, and then your eye goes up and around? I think that's about where I want to be, but I'm going to leave the wider crop just for now, since we're going to be taking this one into Photoshop. I'm going to back off on the shadow fill. I don't want it to be too middle range and too much crazy midtones coming out of those shadows. We want those shadows. We want the full tonal range. And if you see a pattern here, it's that I'm just going to darken down the highlights on that rear water just a little bit so we don't lose it, and a little bit more right here. We do not want to be clipping when we go in to do the final process on this. I can do a lot with burn and dodge in Photoshop. We have a lot of power there, but I don't want to lose my details before I do that. So I want to maintain that texture, and you'll see sometimes me doing just these small little brush-ins and exposure controls to control kind of micro areas. That's too much, obviously. And can feather this one a little more. The other thing I'm going to consider going through these is the different options, right? So this one's really wide. This one's also really good, and it's a little more misty and hazy on the edge. And so, again, the question is, let's take a similar process. Let's actually copy the process from the previous one that we just worked on, okay? So I'm going to copy pretty much everything, not the crop. And I'll just go to this next one, Shift-Command-C, Shift-Command-V, and I'm going to paste those settings in. You can see how my visualization is a little bit tighter on this one. And let's look at the two side by side. And I know I'm getting really nitty-gritty on this this time with you guys, but I really wanted to show really this whole process and how much we can put into really refining our compositions and then the finished work. This one is a little bit different. You can see, and I remember doing this, you can see that I moved my composition a little more over, and I also waited until the sun changed a little bit. And we could argue that this one on the right is better. And ultimately, we're just going to have to pick one and go with it. But this has got great ethereal feel. The rocks wrap around really nicely, and it has less of this specular highlighting going on over here. It's a little more misty and shady over here. Again, coming back to some images, you're just going to get the mist a little bit differently. Let's actually look and see if we're looking at the full frame on that one. And if I've cropped it at all, because I may have cropped a little off. Yeah, just a little bit I cropped on that one. And so we could pull back a little on the bottom here. The top is looking pretty good. And I'll leave a little space, but ultimately I'm going to want to crop that tree right up to the edge. So these are both good, and I'm going to call these both 5s. And we'll take one of these. We'll take one of these into finished process. But I do want to take a moment to make one of these a nice black and white process. So I'm going to put the silver power on here. And these kind of scenes can be really intricate in black and white and also really complicated. And so when you're thinking about whether you want to do a black and white, you really got to think about the light. When you take away color is a diverting factor, and you can control the eye with color. It actually marries with the tone and can be used to diminish or increase the way an eye is attracted. But when you take away the color, notice how everything kind of goes gray. And this is why usually if I do a black and white image, I'm going to visualize and plan the entire image for it, and I'm going to shoot in the light that's meant for a black and white image. Now, I was considering black and whites when I shot these, but the thing is with a black and white is we could pull out, right? We could bring tons of rich detail, and it'd be like razor sharp all the way through here. and it would just print really cool. But it has to be a special kind of image. So I'm actually going to kind of sit on this one and just think, well, do I really want this to be a black and white? Generally, I'm not going to do a black and white and a color of the same composition on the wall, right? I try to be decisive. I think it's important as artists that we kind of come back and we be decisive. So I don't want to go too long here. Let's just glance through a couple of these other ones. And I just want to show you kind of what I'm talking about. Look how if we switch to a black and white, it changes the dynamic very quickly. And in a color, you might have a focal point because of the color. But in a black and white, your focal point is only because of the light. And that's why it's very important that when you're shooting for black and white, you should always be thinking about the light. But you see how it kind of becomes a little bit of a jumbled mess when I just go for a black and white on this. We have to shoot and plan for the black and white and almost go exclusively for that. That's not to say there could be no good black and whites here. In fact, this one with the sun rays coming through would probably come out and make a pretty muy bonita black and white. And so this one is right up my alley in the black and white. And you can see that because we kind of have this misty light and these different textures, you notice how compared to some of the other ones when we converted it, this one worked with black and white because it's composed and set up to be versatile for black and white. I honestly don't remember if I was thinking of a black and white or a color composition when I shot this particular frame, but when I was in this setting, I was considering my possibilities here. The fact that I had these little green leaves that were kind of illuminated and the texture of the branches, but still kind of a rich darkness. You see what's happening here is we have a sun flare here and we have this beautiful texture on these leaves here, and that's a counterbalance. I love angular counterbalances that kind of help our eye bounce across the frame, but don't lead it out. Notice how they're surrounded by deep shadow around the tree and around the sun. So you can kind of come in here, bounce off of here, right? Go up here through the water, come back up to here and bounce around. So which one is better? I'm going to take two of my favorite compositions and we're just going to consider both of those, whether a black or white or color. And a lot of it's going to go back to, do you really love black and white or color the best? It's hard for me to give up the richness of this jungle color and the mists and everything going on here, although I do like this as a black and white as well. Bear in mind, these aren't duplicates. These are two different images that are slightly different. And this works as a black and white, and we can really bring that out. And of course, in this, the Silver Power preset that's going to be in this month's, I'm going to include in this month's kit for you guys, you'll probably notice if we go to the black and white mix, you can see how I've brought out those greens by using the channels. And that's really the key to black and whites, is really to be able to use those channels to bring out the colors you want. So utilize that color information while at the same time making the emphasis on tone alone. This is something that in the darkroom days, of course, we would do with color filters on the black and white film. Okay, that is our raw edit. So we have a nice group of images here. And let's take our 5 stars, and we've kind of got these different 5 stars. We decided not to keep this one for now because it was a little soft. And got the black and white version of this, which this black and white version I don't like near as well because it's too mid-tone. It gets too muddled. But I do like this as a color, and this as a color. Both these are nice. We have to decide which one to go with on those. We have both the black and white and the silver version of the sun flare one, and then we have the wider view. Bear in mind, these were taken on a couple of different days and different settings. I was really kind of in paradise down here in Tamasopo, Mexico, on this river. I was camped right across from it and just got to shoot in a lot of different ways. So there is how we refine down, do the raw process, and we could spend hours just tinkering with the little nuances of the raw process, but we can also take these into Photoshop and really start refining further on next month's photo kit as we dig into the heavy nuances of really taking the image all the way through from camera to perfection.